What's up? What's up? Thanks for joining us for another Homestead Mastermind where we talk about all things homesteading, what we've got going on the farm at the Institute, and try to add to your personal abundance for yourself, your family, and your community. That's what we're all about at sustainablehomestead.com. And today, this week, it's springtime and we've been planting stuff in the garden. The garden is looking really, really wonderful. And I'm just so pleased. We've got a lot of mulch down, a lot of plants in the ground. Like the cold crops that I've told you about before are in the ground, but now we're transitioning to some of that warmer crops. So like tomatoes and peppers, because the weather is cooperating. Always we're like running that leading edge probably a little bit earlier than we should, but I'm happy and the weather is cooperating and we're just due for a really abundant season should everything continue to go as planned. And part of that is because we've got like some volunteer friend labor who has come down to see what we're about and enjoy the homestead, enjoy the food, and take some ideas back for his own property and family properties. So that's been really enjoyable to have extra hands and extra friends on the farm. But he proposed the question this week, and I want to talk about that. Is like, how do you start with nothing? Like so, and how do you get into this? Like, because you've heard me say that 700 to 1,000 acres is where one farmer breaks even, and we're not farming, we're community building. But how do you get started if you don't really have anything to begin with? And that's a super fair, super valid, and important question for people in the community to think about, because the same strategies that get you involved at a nothing level get the farm off the ground, and you have to get to some you can't, so like you just buy your 1,000 acres, it doesn't mean you're profitable. You still have to employ the tools that work on small scale ecosystems, small scale homesteads, backyard gardens, and even in the woods. So to get started, this is why our curriculum is set up the way it is. We spend so much time on bushcraft, teaching people to rub sticks together to make fire, edible plants, tracking, trapping, and the abundance of the woods and nature. And that way, so when we apply the lessons to designing farms, we have really efficient systems. So the first way that everyone needs to be thinking about is like, how can you bushcraft your existence? Our 5 day survival program kind of highlights that in a way that you'll be competent once you get. Sure, it takes practice, but practice develops the confidence. But you will have some level of competence if you go through that, because we arm everybody with a toolkit that can be applied directly for bushcraft. But when we talk about plants and edible plants, I think that's one of the first roads that people need to be thinking about, because plants provide the abundance and how you can change landscapes. There's no such thing as weeds, just indicators of what's going on underneath the soil, what's going on in the soil, and the history of what you're trying to grow. So the first thing is going to be forage, and learn to forage plants and see what the valuable plants are in your area. Start a plant journal and just be observant to your area and what's going on there. But foraging and learning the edible and medicinal plants in your area is a wonderful way to start this journey of homesteading. With that, you're going to learn trees, so you can like make wood products. You can build shelters that'll last a long time. You'll edible and medicinal plants you'll learn, and it's if you have access to the outdoors, you have access to bushcraft and foraging. And so we talk about like uh the survival mindset versus like the abundance caretaker mindset. And so at a certain point, you transition from that bushcraft and foraging into how do we create ecosystems, not just take from the landscape, but give back in an abundant way. And that's now we're kind of talking about like propagation. And so we go from learning the plants to how can we help the plants multiply to make a more efficient ecosystem. That's called propagation. So like seed storage, or if just in the most basic sense, taking the seeds from the plant that you like in the right time of year and throwing them into the ground that you've kind of exposed, whether that be like, so the early like hunter gatherer people, when they would have a fire, they would cook their food, and then all of their like the scraps would go into that fire. Not obviously not while it's on, right? Maybe not obviously, but so well, excuse me, while the fire is out, all that carbon remains, all that ash remains, and then the seeds would go into that. So this really fertile and prepared soil bed from the fire, the seeds and rinds or whatever's not being eaten uh, goes into that. It starts to rot. We'll talk about compost later, but it starts to rot, and then the seed grows forth. And so the next year, while they're doing their hunting gathering thing over large landscapes, moving with the herd, they can come back to that area and have the like the food that they know they like because they ate it for dinner the evening like a year prior, 2 years prior, whenever they were there last, and maybe they never came back. But that's how like landscapes were changed for with animal integration, but ultimately people integration. And there's lots of studies that show the Amazon rainforest is actually like an intentional planting done in that way. So I think that's hugely interesting. And so it really highlights the value of propagation and foraging the plants that you want, and then making sure that there's more of those plants available next time you come through the landscape. But how do we do that in everyday society? And there's a whole group of people doing something called guerrilla gardening, and more power to them. What they do is they go out to like state parks, like national parks, local park, anywhere, schools, like anywhere there is like green space that's not getting mowed, and they start propagating the plants and growing a garden that otherwise people aren't going to know is there. And that's called guerrilla gardening. And it's just it's hugely important, and it's hugely inspiring to see people putting like mushroom logs and but all of this, you have to know your ecosystem, right? Because if you're spreading invasive plants or plants like goji berry that people enjoy but have a way of like taking over landscapes, if they're not like curtailed over time and managed, like meaningfully managed, you can't just like throw it and let it go unless you pick the right plants. So that's why foraging, the propagation, all of that, we have to know our ecosystem, know the plants, know when to harvest them, and how to propagate them before we even start this journey. So that's why your plant journal is important. That's why having the right field guides is important. And that's why educating yourself is most important before you do any of that, because you really do have the ability to like destroy landscapes when you think you're doing the right part. Plus, if you're caught, people don't like when you plant plants where you're not supposed to. Those park rangers frown on it in most cases. But if you do it right, no one's going to know, and you're just going to have the abundance of nature through the connection and the plants and things that you have done. With that is like tracking, trapping, hunting, and fishing. You can ask people to use their land, but those ways you can really put some meat on the table without going the full like farm route, without buying a huge piece of land and having the capital expenditure, without spending the money to have your own piece of the world. And then, that might just be as easy as a hunting license and a hunter safety class, but now you're in the game and you're homesteading on publicly available land without having to just put out all that money. If you want more information about that, either come see us for a class. We do the crash course survival, the Father's Day weekend, the five survival essentials class that's like a week long. We have advanced skills class, and even no knife scout courses where we go off and test our skills with nothing more than a knife. So I mentioned all of that because bushcraft is the root of the homestead, and it's how you can get into being a homesteader, being a farmer, being a community builder without having that huge expenditure of money. And we all know we're trying to maximize our dollar, just like we're trying to maximize our homestead and have the least amount of change or the least amount of expenditure for the greatest effect. And that's kind of what I want to talk about now is how do we so let's say we do have a townhome or a small piece of land. How can we get some more benefit? And there's one group called Grow Food Not Lawns, and if you're in a townhome, if you're trying to do that, that's a great resource. But how, like, we spend so much time growing grass. Actually, sod farming is one of the highest water intensive classes or water intensive agriculture methods of agriculture. So if you can grow grass, you can likely grow whatever you want, but we're going to have to amend the soil in that process. So, and how do we amend the soil, right? I've told you many times that the first step, if you know you want to grow something, is start peeing where you want to grow. And I know it sounds disgusting, but if we look at commercial fertilizer, ammonia, like ammonia nitrate, and ammonium in your urine, it's the same root, and it leads to the same bacteria that wants to break that down. And so it's how you can fertilize your soil with nothing. So bottom line, be peeing where you want to grow your food. Now, we're not peeing on the food that we're growing, but before we get there, to establish some beds and establish the beneficial bacteria in the soil, maybe you want to be peeing where you're growing that food or going to be growing that food. If you're already living, and I assume you are because you're watching this podcast, you're eating something already. And if you're preparing your own food, you're going to have some level of waste. Like I love bananas. And so there's bananas left over. If you're chopping onions, I know you have like that root ball, the seeds from peppers, just things that you don't eat. You can compost all of that. So what is compost? Compost is a scientific way of stacking or semi-scientific. It's really not, it's a very complex bacterial process, but you don't have to be super scientific about it. Just stack all your organic material in a pile and occasionally turn it over because there's the breakdown is aerobic. Typically, it's either aerobic or anaerobic, meaning like with air or without air. One goes much faster. So if you add air to it, like the supercharger of a car burns gas faster because there's more air shoved into the engine. It's the same thing with bacteria when you're doing the composting process. But all you have to do is build a pile of your organic material and let it sit for long enough. And then you will have, preferably cover it with the tarp so the rain's not washing all the nutrients away. But stack all your stuff and it will ultimately turn into really rich, nutrient-dense soil that you can use either in your raised beds, which we'll talk about here shortly, or in your garden, or if you just have access to a balcony, your balcony hanging planters or the tomato grow bags, or just a pot by the window. If that's all you can do, that's all you can do, but it's a start and it's better than nothing, particularly when we're maximizing every available resource that we have. So compost, and then let's talk about raised beds because I mentioned it, right? So we take our compost, and so raised beds are great. They're raised beds is just a container that holds our soil, typically outside. If it's inside, it's a pot, but we got to put soil in it so the plants grow, because plants just don't grow on air. We need some sort of structure to hold the roots, have the bacteria that fertilizes the plant. That's part of the cycles. So if we're buying planting material at the store, that can get really costly, particularly when some of these plants require multiple square feet. Just in the garden, we planted artichokes the other day, and they grow huge and expansive, and they require a lot of dirt. And if you're paying, I don't want to quote it wrong because it's been so long since I've bought planting soil, but some of the stuff like the pro mix that we use in the greenhouse sometimes, that's like $50 for maybe a cubic yard, or maybe less. Maybe that's but it really doesn't go that way. If you're building raised beds, you're spending a lot of money just to throw dirt. When there's dirt everywhere, why are we buying dirt that's been transported all over the world or all over the country and ends up at the hardware store for you to buy, and then gets put back on the farm? Let's create the dirt, or let's remediate the dirt that we have at the farm already. And we do that with compost. But even still, that compost is super costly in our time, and mainly the time that it takes us to gather all the materials to then let them rot. So a great way to maximize space in your garden and add some efficiency is a hugelkultur bed. We've had those in the garden. We have actually the largest hugelkultur that I know of, definitely in Virginia, probably east of the Mississippi, maybe in the whole country. But we've got like 240 feet of hugelkultur bed in our market garden example. But what that is we take wood that doesn't have another use, and we chop it into like large firewood sections. Those fill a trench on contour for us, and that allows us to harvest water at the same time. But when the water comes in contact with the wood that's been encapsulated with dirt, that wood starts to break down and releases nitrogen and fertilizer and creates the environment that bacteria loves to fertilize plants. And so it allows us to kind of, if we put that system into a raised bed, now we're not building that much. Now we're not paying that much for soil. Here's a notepad that I have, but if here's our raised bed, right? And like, so here is the raised bed, pardon my artwork. Down here, we can fill this area with logs, right? And then this area is dirt. Oh wow, I'm amazing being able to write in the screen like that. But so our wood is down here, the dirt is there. Maybe I'm not amazing. Whatever, you get the idea. Dirt's up here, and that reduces some of the volume that is required. We don't have to buy as much dirt. We don't have to make as much compost to fill the raised bed. Now, when we put a plant in here, plant's super happy because it has the fertilization from the wood. When we water, there's the raindrops. It gets absorbed in the soil, absorbed by the logs down there. And all of that is just like mostly free material if you have access to the outdoors and you've put together your bushcraft pack like we talked about in the front. Whether you're cutting those sticks, you're just picking them off the ground, or you're cutting them while you're pruning a trail. But it allows you to stack functions and get the most change with it allows you to get the least amount of change in like your efforts to get the greatest effect, right? That's what we say in the permaculture class, is least change for greatest effect. So we have compost, we have raised beds, we have hugelkultur. Another thing that, like, so if you're living in society now, like chances are you're buying stuff, like where do we buy stuff? Amazon, Walmart, CVS, like with these giant chain stores, we put our dollar expenditure out, but whatever we get is typically comes in a box, right? So how can we handle, like, cardboard is an organic material. We can put it in the compost bin, we can burn it in the fire, or we can sheet mulch with it, and that changes can change large landscapes very quickly. So if you have a grass lawn, sheet mulching is a great way to do it. So what is sheet mulch? It's the ground, and then we put a layer of cardboard over top. Now, typically we don't want the dyed cardboard because I don't really want those chemicals in the soil. And then on top of that, we put grass clippings. Over time, water and bugs and like worms start eating that sheet mulch, or eating the and breaking down the cardboard, and then we have the ability to change the landscape that way. We have really rich, fertilized soil for us to plant something in. Another thing that people do that's very similar to the sheet mulching is raising worms for vermiculture. And so you just stack up the paper and then you have some worms, you introduce worms into that mix. And now you're creating a really, like a byproduct of that, of vermiculture, is a really rich worm tea that you can use as fertilizer and spray on the top of your plants. And then you can use like their castings, right? Their worm shit, and use that in your compost, in your planting beds, or just to remediate the dirt that's in your landscape. Let me see what else we have. So yeah, we have raised beds, we have hanging baskets, we have compost, we have hugelkultur, we have vermiculture, sheet mulch. Did I already say that in the list? I don't know. But the other kind of composting is using your shit. And so we poop into a bucket. If you ever use the composting toilet, it's how do you get rid of stuff from people? It just takes longer. That process just takes longer. And I think the California code is 3 years. So we needs to be composting the human manure for 3 years before we use it in the garden. But let's say we're not using it in the garden. We can use it to fertilize around our fruit trees. That way we don't really want to be doing lettuce or like broccoli or things that grow in the human manure, but it's better around like tomato plants or fruit trees. And that way the fruit is not sitting in the leafy material is not like sitting in that human manure compost, just to be the most safe. That gives us a little bit more buffer because I mean, I know what comes from my body, but like hepatitis C particularly doesn't cook out in the compost, which is like 147 degrees or something. So you need to be really careful with one, your compost, like scraps that you get from people, and two, like human manure. But I don't expect a lot of people to be doing human manure, but it is something worth mentioning. Your neighbor's probably not going to enjoy it if you're living in a townhome, living in an apartment, and you're composting your manure just to put on your plants. But it's worth mentioning because that's how you can get into like permaculture, bushcraft, homesteading, and change landscapes without a whole lot of input. We've been working in the beds out here, right? And so a lot of people when they garden or when they farm, they buy a tractor, they buy a plow. And I know we had a Homestead Mastermind, I think just last week, where we were talking about not buying a tractor because they're so expensive. So how can we do things without tractor involvement? So they say, oh, I'm not going to till with a tractor, but I am going to till with a tiller. That's an expense too. I think they run like 700 to $1,000. Or you can have like the market gardener tiller with multiple attachments, and that can get just super expensive. Like I think they start like a new BCS tiller, I think it's like $13,000 or something. And if you've ever used the one that we have, we didn't pay that much. Ours is like way used because they last a long time and it's great, but that's a huge expense and if we're trying to get in cheap, we don't want to do that. So it's worth mentioning forks. Like just like the fork that you eat with, there's forks that work in the garden. So the tool is like a digging fork. It looks like a pitchfork, but it has a much thicker tines to be stuck into the ground and break the dirt so you can start planting in them. And then today or yesterday, we showed everybody here at the homestead, we showed everybody the broad fork. And that's a much larger fork that goes into the ground and you rock it back and forth and use your body weight to break up the soil. And if you're getting into gardening, those are like some of the cheapest but most effective tools for changing landscape, coupled with sheet mulch, coupled with cover cropping, coupled with composting, and all these things that we talked about today. When you put them together in a package for your own house, you can really change, or apartment or open space or like communal garden for apartment complexes, or your church. If you're nearby us, you can see some of the church projects that we work on. There's lots of ways to change landscapes very, very cheaply. That's what we're about at Sustainable Homestead. Because again, we're not farmers, we're community builders, and the average farm takes 700 to 1,000 acres for one farmer, excuse me, for one farmer to break even. So we're not trying to do that. We're trying to build rich, abundant agricultural systems that can take care of the people that live in them. And I hope that was worthwhile for you. We teach classes in this all the time. Sustainablehomestead.com has way more information. Check the YouTube, the Facebook, the TikTok. We give this information away all the time. Check us out for a tour, and I'll walk you through all these techniques that we've talked about. But now I'm going to open it up to questions. We'll stop the recording as we always do, and we'll just have a chat. I really do appreciate your time here today. I hope you learned something, and I expect to see you here on the next Homestead Mastermind every Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. That's Eastern Standard Time. Thanks for watching. Drop your questions in the chat. Here we go.